Go on.
Hello there, ladies and gentlemen, and welcome back to the History of Yesterday podcast with me, Andrei, and Calin over here. So, on today's topic, we're going to be talking about alternate history, and to be more specific, we're going to be talking about the time the Soviet Union actually sold Alaska to the United States. And we're going to then continue on with a bit of the Russian Civil War. And by alternate history, we're trying to discuss different scenarios of how things could have happened if someone did this or other leaders came to power. We're just gonna bear with us 1 second because Calin here is we're having a bit of technical difficulties with the chat boxes, I think.
Okay, that's okay. So we have the Facebook chat box seems to be working. I'm just setting up the YouTube one, the YouTube and Twitch one. Hopefully this is a bit better than last time, because I knew last time people were saying that they wanted to see their comments from Facebook and from all of the platforms that we use. So
for some reason we can't implement all the comments on the same box.
Yeah, so
Hello,
this should be a
Avinash.
better. Yeah,
Welcome.
I think this looks a bit better. So if anyone types a comment on any of the platforms that we use, you should see yourself on the screen now. With that said, I'm gonna change the topic as usual to what we're gonna be speaking about. Alaska. I'm gonna see if I can find a bit of space for it. We have a new layout, so it's going to be a bit of a struggle to do everything, because we're still not 100% with it, as is a new everything is new. Yeah, there we are. So starting off with something that a lot of people don't realize, that America didn't actually own the state of Alaska since its creation. Alaska was actually purchased from the...
Calin, just a second stopping you, because I think the title of the current topic still shows...
Oh yeah, there we are, sorry. I forgot to transition. So, yeah.
There we go.
Going back to what I said, so Alaska wasn't actually owned by the US until the year... I'll get the exact year because I don't want to be wrong with this. So Alaska wasn't owned by the US until where's the date? Yeah, 1867. Until that date, the region of Alaska was actually owned by the Russian Empire, which was one of the biggest powers of Europe at the time. Something that's quite consistent when we look at Russian history. But even though they were such a big power within Europe, they lacked a lot of the infrastructure and technology that the rest of the European empires had. So because Russia, as always, was an expansionist power, a few years before they sold off Alaska in the early 1860s, they declared war upon the Ottoman Empire during a time that is now referred to as the Crimean War, where the Russian Empire wanted to take over parts of the then weakened Ottoman Empire. To the Ottoman Empire's aid came France and England, who, after years of fighting against each other during the Napoleonic Wars, have ended up being allied together. Something again that is quite consistent in the latter stages of the 19th and 20th century. The Crimean War, the 1860s Crimean War, was very expensive for the Russian Empire. It crippled the empire. Their military was destroyed. They saw that they had a big technological lack of technology compared to the rest of the world. And due to this big bankruptcy that they entered because of this war, they needed to raise some funds. And the king at the time decided that the land of Alaska should be what is being sold off. Because for the Russians, even though Alaska was their only overseas territory and a hallmark of all of the powerful empires at the time is having overseas colonies, Alaska was actually losing the money. Because although they were getting, the main product of Alaska at the time was pelts, because the Russian explorers didn't have enough time to delve deeper into the Alaskan heartland and find the resources that America did while it was under American ownership. So it was actually much more costly for the Russians to keep the land, keep it protected using ships and such, rather than just selling it off. So on the date of October 18th, 1867, the Russian territory of Alaska, as in Russian is Alyaska instead of Alaska, was sold to the United States of America for $7,200,000, which is around $100 million today, if we adjust it for inflation. And this was obviously a very good choice for America, even though at the time many considered it a bad deal for the Americans, as Alaska was just seen as a frozen wasteland. It ended up paying off for the Americans big time, as we know today that there was a big gold rush in the years leading up to the end of the 19th century, and during the 20th century there was a big oil rush in the region, which made Alaska one of the richest states of America. Obviously, the Russian Empire couldn't have seen into the future and didn't have the resources to explore Alaska and decide what really was its value. But now we come to the question of what if Russia not necessarily realized the value of Alaska, but what if they decided to raise funds otherwise, thinking that they must hold Alaska to keep their prestige up of being an empire, because, as I said, most empires at the time had overseas colonies, and this was their only overseas colony. This is a quite interesting question to ask, because this plays a part in most of the events that we have experienced during the 20th century, most specifically, obviously, World War II and the Cold War, in which both Russia and America obviously partook in. So in one circumstance, Russia and the US were allied, so this purchase would have been a bit less impactful. But in terms of the second topic, which is the Cold War, the lack of the US purchasing Alaska would have had a much bigger impact, and that's something we would like to discuss today. So if anyone in chat wants to bring in some of their ideas about the topic, or if anyone else wants to give a bit of input overall on this,
I think I'll start us off by saying one of the main ideas that I can think of, which is really most impactful, it could have caused World War III if Alaska was still Soviet land, is the Cuban Missile Crisis. Because at the time, both America and the Soviet Union were in a rush to just get as many nuclear weapons as possible, and they wanted to have them close enough, or at least in range of each capital. So what the Russians did is what the Soviets did was that they took most of their missiles and took them into Cuba, because Cuba at the time was run by also a communist leader, which I think it was Gorbachev at the time when the deal went down. I don't remember exactly.
No, it was Khrushchev because he got deposed
Khrushchev, yeah.
after. I just want to have a note when we talk about the Cuban Missile Crisis, because you said that obviously the Soviets wanted to put their missiles closer to the U.S. capital. Castro was the leader of Cuba at the time, Chippy, as he rightly said on Twitch. The Soviets weren't the aggressors of the Cuban Missile Crisis. Rather, the Americans were, because before the Soviets actually sent the missiles over to Cuba, the Americans instated missile bases in both Turkey and Italy, which obviously this is at the doorstep of the Russians, and feeling threatened, as any country would do in that scenario, they sought to have a repellent to this threat that was very close, because both the missile bases in Italy and Turkey could strike Moscow very easily due to the range of the missiles that the Americans placed there. As such, placing missiles in Cuba would only be fair, which is obviously not how we are taught it in history books. Most people are taught that the evil Russians aggressed on the brave Americans by putting in missiles in Cuba, and the really smart John F. Kennedy managed to negotiate his way out of it. I'm not slating John F. Kennedy. I think he was a great leader, much better than any recent leader of America. But we must look at the event in a historical context. In terms of changing the Cold War, of course, having land so close to the US capital would have been massive for the war. It would have given Russia a land border with the US, which would have certainly heated up the Cold War, because for the most part, the Cold War wasn't really fought between the two states due to the distance between them. That's why both states used proxy wars, such as the Vietnam War, Afghanistan, so on and so forth. The fact that both of the countries would have not necessarily a land border, because obviously Canada was still in between them, but such land in such in close proximity, it would maybe lead to the Cold War heating up much quicker than it did in our time, unless some resolution could be achieved.
I think it would have been much different, because moving all of the missiles from the Soviet Union into Cuba, someone's going to notice, and someone obviously noticed. But if it were to be in the Alaskan land, this would have been top secret. And then again, because Alaska was, like you said, a frozen land, pretty much very rural. Not many people actually live there, at least from what we know. It would have been a perfect place for more bases, more nuclear weapon testing, and so on and so forth.
I mean,
and I think I did read in an article that there was at some time, I think there was an explorer in the 19th century, at the end of 19th century, who actually discovered uranium in Alaska, but they weren't sure what it was at the time. And they saw that this whatever resource was seemed very dangerous, so they never went to further explore this site in Alaska.
On the point of Alaska remaining barren, I don't think that would have happened, because the Soviet Union had a history of taking land that is obviously unlivable and trying to make it livable. They tried to populate the sparsely populated Russian tundra, the Kazakhstani steppes, and other such regions that, before the influence of the Soviets, really didn't have that much human presence in. So I think because Alaska would have been such a challenge, because many people saw Alaska before oil and everything was discovered as basically just a piece of land that's wasted in terms of it being maintained and being protected. I think the Soviets would have taken this as a challenge to show the world what the communists could really do, and would have deported many people to Alaska to settle the region, building cities such as the cities in the Urals, such as Chelyabinsk, which was known as Tankrad during World War II, where most of the tanks that the Soviet Union was building were created. I think that Alaska would have become a bit of a industrial heartland, as in to kind of like show off at the doorstep of the USA to say like these natural circumstances aren't stopping us. The just the will of the workers.
Comparing the capitalist muscle
Yeah.
besides the communist muscle. And showing, just like you said, showing that, with the Soviet Union not having as many resources and especially not such a big financial muscle as the US at the time. So it would have really been a challenge, and it really showed the world that, look, from nothing we can actually make something. Not like the capitalists say that you can become rich from absolutely nothing.
But I
But
think
obviously, just like you said, the Russians never, even if they probably knew about all the gold in Alaska. I'm not saying that they would have sold. Obviously, they wouldn't have sold the land in that case, but I don't think they would have exploited that much at the time.
I mean, from my understanding is obviously the gold wasn't as valued during the communist times
Yeah.
to the population, but it was still a really good bargaining chip with other countries. So I think that they would have exploited the gold, if only for the reason that they wanted to have a way to trade with other countries. We have another comment on Twitch. Chippy said, I think the Cold War was just a stupid fight between the communists, USSR, Stalin, and the rest of the world. Of course, the main US, because they had more money and balls. The Cold War was a bit more complicated. It's, well, at least in my opinion, it's not only it shows the characteristic of both countries and both leaders.
I just want to stop you there for a second. I would say that the Cold War started with, especially when the Second War ended, and they wanted, because that's what the Soviets felt, that they lost the most in the Second World War, so they had this need to get the most out of it, and especially get the whole of Germany. That was the main battle that they were fighting. And then came the Americans, which said, we also lost so much because we also gave most of our resources, we gave so many soldiers to you. But then again, I'm never going to discuss this, because in my view, in my point of view, it was the Soviets who should have taken everything, because let's remind ourselves that beside Pearl Harbor, no other American land was touched during World War II. And the Soviets, they had most of their country taken and destroyed. At least a good part of it. I see it from that point of view. And it's, because it hits very different when all the civilians and all the working labor in the country, having your houses destroyed, seeing everything, what's happening in front of your eyes, and then you have the Americans, which they're just being fed propaganda down their throats, saying, oh, look, this is happening on the front, or that's happening on the front, but they don't actually know what's happening on the front, or how cruel World War II was.
I mean, both countries suffered from a propaganda problem, as did I think no country on this planet can ever say that is impartial. We have another comment on Twitch. Stalin started the fight when Stalin hid that Hitler was dead. Yeah, it's Stalin until his death still didn't believe that Hitler died in the Führer bunker. That
was more of a psychological problem that he had in his mind, because he hated him so much that he didn't want to believe that he was dead. He wanted to kill him with his own hands.
We discussed this on the first podcast, if you are interested a bit more into that. But what I was going to say is that you mentioned that Stalin would have wanted to take the whole of Germany as compensation. But as a follow-up to Germany being split, Stalin actually proposed to the Allies, to France, USA, UK, in something known as the Stalin Note, to unify the whole of Germany, and then let them choose a government democratically. But the Allies didn't want to do this, because from surveys after the war, they found out that if this was to happen, there would have been a majority who would have voted for a socialist-leaning government, meaning that instead of just East Germany being leaning towards the USSR, it would have been the entire of Germany, which obviously the Allies saw as a threat, because after Germany wreaked so much havoc in Europe in those 6 years, a Soviet-controlled Germany would have been a much bigger problem. We have some more comments on Twitch. Why did Stalin hide that? Stalin got more than half of Europe. Well, Stalin hid the fact that Hitler was dead. I'm not sure why. That is certainly a topic to discuss. It's mostly because his mental well-being wasn't at his best shape during the war, especially after all that stress. So in his mind, I don't think he was hiding the fact that Hitler was dead. I think he just didn't believe that Hitler was dead. Yeah. He also says Stalin got more than half of Europe, and he wanted more. I mean,
That's right there.
yeah, no, but we could also argue that the US got more than half of Europe, because through the Marshall Plan, the US basically puppeted the entire of Western Europe, or the entire, not as much the United Kingdom, because they didn't suffer as much damage during the war, but all of the war-ravaged countries such as France, the sectioned off parts of West Germany that united later on, Italy, Austria. Some funds went to Switzerland, although obviously they tried to be impartial, so it didn't receive as many funds from the Marshall Plan, and the Nordic countries, of course. All of these countries who received money from the Marshall Plan ended up being kind of indebted to the US, because although this was a no strings attached deal, the countries through the Marshall Plan received US dollars, which meant that they could only buy US products with the money that the US gave them, which was just a way of the US further taking advantage of the the lack of economic power that Europe had. Let's think which country done well. I don't know what you mean by that. Do you mean which country ended up the best out of the Second World War? Because that would we could have a look into that. But this we've gone on a bit of a tangent here. This all kind of ties in to the consequences of Russia not saying Alaska. Even though we've gone quite far, we've gone back to World War II. Like most things link back to World War II. The fact that Russia would have had a foothold in the US would have meant that maybe World War II itself would have gone differently. Chippy saying, let's think, Poland, Romania, Hungary. Yeah. I need you to explain the previous sentence, because I'm not sure what you mean about let's think which country done well. Are you saying that
economically?
Yeah, the economic politically, because you could say obviously Eastern Europe got ravaged by the Soviets, because after the war, especially East Berlin, all of the East Berlin industry was just picked up by the Soviets, put on a train and just sent to Moscow, because they sought reparations from the German people after they ravaged the USSR countryside. Something that's kind of like expected, considering the damage that they've done. But if we look at the rest of the European countries that the USSR took into their sphere of influence, obviously it wasn't very fair. The control that they took over Poland, especially after the USSR themselves invaded Poland. So there is no excuse in to say that the USSR deserved Poland, because they actually partook in their destruction in 1939. All of these countries have been under the Russian umbrella. Yeah, of course. Obviously, some countries even got annexed in the USSR, such as the Moldova, the Bessarabian region of Moldova, the Ukrainian SSR, Belarus, yeah, the Baltic countries, parts of Finland. So we can't really say that Russia didn't receive their fair share. But obviously, it's a balancing act.
I think it was also more of a political fight, I would say, between capitalism and communism to its actual origins. You see, they both show off so much. They both show off so much potential and promise so much to each of their citizens. But at the end of the day, I mean, if we look at efficiency-wise, you can't compare capitalism to communism, at least in the Cold War era. They've done so much more with so little.
What I was going to move on is back to again, we're going on a tangent here, but this all ties in, because I was going to say that because the USSR did have a foothold in America, I was gonna say that maybe Hitler would have seen the Soviets differently, because obviously Germany saw that they didn't see, although they there was a lot of industry in Germany that had home in the US. So a big one is IBM. IBM actually helped, or a section of IBM actually helped the Germans in the Holocaust, which is a topic for another day. But Germany and America were linked economically quite closely, but even like the economic connection is quite far away. I think that even though this connection existed, maybe if the Soviets did have such a foothold in the Americas, because a big problem that Hitler found when he was trying to invade Britain is the lack of logistics overseas. I think that having an ally which had access to the entire of the North American continent would have meant that maybe Hitler would have allied with Stalin rather than attack him, because as he did with the Italians, he made permanent compromises to reach his goals. So with Italy, obviously he didn't see Italy as equals. He saw although he did see the people of the Mediterranean as a lower class, he hated the Slavs more. But in this case, even though he might have hated the Slavs more than he did other people, he might have made a compromise to take down one of his biggest competitors. Because in this scenario, at the beginning of World War II, the Soviets weren't on the Allied side, so the Soviets were still trying to stay neutral, because they saw the power that the Nazis had when they invaded France, and they looked at the military, which were, although it was a very strong military, they couldn't really face the mechanical power of the Nazi war machine. They looked at it and said
it was more about manpower than actual.
Well, yeah, but it might have made, in my opinion, I think it might have made Hitler think twice about declaring war on the USSR, and he might have even tried to ally with the Soviets to try to take down the Allies, which would have had to be done very precariously, because obviously as soon as, let's say in this scenario, Hitler allies with the USSR, this would mean that there would have been an Axis-Comintern pact, which would have increased both their powers, and it would have been a war. It would have been kind of a World War III in a way. But
that in that scenario, then what would have happened with America?
Yeah,
would they declared war on the Soviets?
No, this one,
because if this scenario was to play out, then there was no way in hell that the Soviets and the Nazis could actually be defeated by the Americans.
No, because that's what I'm getting on.
About a whole different thing, because you will have then the Germans, which, let's say, they wouldn't expand so much, obviously, because probably the Soviets wouldn't allow them to expand so much. They would make allies with many other European countries, especially in Western Europe. But then again, you have also the Japanese, yeah. So then you have three powerful nations, which at the time they had one of the best militaries in the world, leaving aside the Americans, of course.
Yeah.
So a huge push like that would have made really a different story, and I think would have seen life very different. But what I wanted to say is that I want to kind of go against you on that, because I think even though Hitler did have the potential to see such a window, and he had the brains to work it all out, and maybe even play Stalin a little bit, and at the end stab him back or something like that. His hatred again was too big to allow him to do something like that. And again, there was a small minority. I don't know exactly the numbers, but you still had quite a few Jewish people in the Soviet Union. So that might have been, again, a factor that might have stopped him from doing so.
But again, like, it's...
Because this would have made a potential of him allying with what was the most hated type of people in the world.
To him, yeah.
Yeah.
Well, yeah, I'm... obviously, this is an what-if scenario, but I think... Hitler made compromises during World War II. As I said, he made races such as the Japanese honorary Aryans, and for such a situation, I think that this would have been too big of an advantage to pass up, because Hitler would have had no way, even if he took even if he took the UK, he would have had no way to bring the US out of the war. And neither would have, like, if the UK was taken down, the US would have had a hard time. Oh, we have a tip from an anonymous donator. Thank you for the $4.20. No name on that donation, unfortunately, but yeah, thank you for the donation. What was I saying? Yeah, so I think if the UK would have been destroyed, which obviously with the resources of the USSR, it could have definitely been done, considering they wouldn't have had the two-front war. This would have, without the help of the USSR, this would have turned into a stalemate. And in this, this is how this would have had to play out. So Hitler invades Poland, splits it with the USSR, keeps friendly with them, invades the rest of Western Europe, takes over France, then sees that he can't come over to the UK, and realizes that he needs to find a way to choke out the people in the UK. To create a two-front war for the Americans, he invites the Soviets into the Axis, creating a Axis Comintern Pact, which means that the USSR, which then has a foothold in the Americas, starts to invade America through Canada, which Canada didn't have an amazing military because obviously they're on a continent where they don't really need it, unless obviously the Russians attack. The Canadians would have fell quite easily, and then the Americans, instead of sending resources to the UK, would have had to divert a lot of their resources to defend their homeland, which means that
then again, to stay on topic as well, if this were to happen, then the Russians could use Alaska to push through Canada into America.
Yeah, that's what I was saying. Where Chippy said if Hitler took over the UK, next was Russia and the rest. In this hopeful world that we're talking about, there would have been an alliance between the two. But obviously, after the war, it would have been quite similar to the premise of The Man in the High Castle, but except for Japan and America holding being like the powers of the world, it would have been the USSR and Germany, because in this scenario, Germany takes over the UK quite easily without the UK being helped by the Americans. The USSR easily takes America because the USSR, although they didn't build up to defend the Germans, they would have had so much time without the threat of Germany invading them to build up the industry enough where they could rival the Americans. And with a bit of help from the German Reich and Japan, which at the time was a very powerful nation, they could easily take America. And this would split up the power. Actually, I'm going to go back on what I said. It would been a world split in three, with Japan owning most of Asia, USSR perhaps owning half of America with Japan, and then Germany owning most of Europe. Chippy said that the international language would have been German, not English. Yeah, I mean...
and then you would have... It wouldn't have been, because then, if, let's say, all of those three nations were to remain and then no one else was, you would have either had a Cold War between Germany and the USSR, or just an all-out war between the three. Which
would have probably ended.
And I don't think that Nazi Germany would have accepted the fact that, this is enough for us, even though Russia might have a bit more.
Yeah.
Like I said, the scenario kind of doesn't play out when you think about it, because I just simply, maybe if I didn't know about the Second World War, I would have thought differently. But looking at Hitler and Stalin, they don't seem like the two people to go together, And not talking about what happened previously, but let's say if they were to meet and discuss this sort of proposition before the war started.
With all respect, Russia is not having the power and money to take over the US. Well, we forget that the US was a very different country back at the beginning of World War II.
This is why I just want to mention. This is why the alliance between the Americans and the Soviets, or the Russians, and the Second World War worked so good, because America had the economy, had the infrastructure to actually build military weapons, build tanks, build whatever, and send it over to the Russians, who didn't have that, but what they had is manpower. Because Stalin said, just give us the weapons and we'll get the job done.
I just want to counteract because Chippy said the US have more power and balls. The US, especially after the crash of the stock market in the early 30s, wasn't really the power that we think of today, with all of the aircraft carriers projecting their power across the world. Um, the Americans, especially in the early stages of the 20th century, were actually threatened by Mexico, which had although they had a much less powerful military, was still power which threatened the Americans. It wasn't something that they could ignore. This was obviously seen in World War One when Mexico was invited to join the Central Powers, which would have distracted America in a quite similar way that I'm trying to use Alaska to distract America in this scenario. But we have to remember that a lot of America's economy and power was built up during the Cold War, so it's not unfeasible for a semi-industrialized Soviet Union to fight the not as developed Americans, especially if they take more of a backseat during World War II than they took in our scenario. Obviously, the USSR didn't really have the power either at the beginning of World War II, because a lot of the industry was built up as a response to the of the Germans coming in. But it's something that we look at history and we just think of America as this all-powerful nation throughout the 20th century. But the reality is that a lot of their power was built up off the back of World War II and World War One, because they basically helped rebuild Europe, and by helping rebuild Europe, they just they increased a lot of the industry, because, as I said, through the Marshall Plan, all of these countries were forced to buy American goods with the money that they received. So it wasn't really free money; it was just America giving them their equipment, which they were building, which was stimulating their economy, which was
And taking it back.
yeah, which was gaining them power. So yeah, I don't know if anyone else wants to put something in. I think we've talked at length about this. It's
we jumped far from Alaska, but that's the problem, because we just like 20th modern history, or was
Yeah.
especially World War II history too much. Always get enthusiastic and talk about it when we have the chance. I would say that, just like you said, to kind of conclude about it, maybe someone will bring a comment meanwhile, that Alaska, no one saw the potential that Alaska had, or just like you said, the resources, not just the resources, but maybe a vantage point, which I guess, thinking about it's not that good. But at the same time, we're talking about a lot of land where they could have built a lot of infrastructure out of nowhere.
Yeah, it's more beneficial for the Russians to have had than the US, because it would have been a gateway to.
And at the end of the day, I don't think that $7 million. Well, I know at that time might have been quite a lot of money, but even so, for such a big land, not taking into consideration the gold, because obviously they didn't know that they had such huge gold deposits in Alaska. I don't think it's that much.
I'm trying to think. I can do a calculation how much they paid per square mile of land in modern money, because it's not a it's quite a small figure considering the price of land. It's $200, just under $200 per square mile of land. Chippy has said Russia is a power on the world map, but not as the US.
Yeah, that's because it was influenced so much during Cold War, and it's influenced so much today. Because again, when we're talking about the Western world, we're mainly referring to America, because they are influencing from pretty much each point of view. I mean, we have the corporations today, many big businesses that are actually, kind of trying to portray the way people should live their lives. And this has mainly been affecting the whole world, and especially just Russia as well, because everyone goes in with the trend, everyone goes in with what sells in the West, better said.
I mean, the West is where
it's a
money
prospect
lies.
it's a prospect that they set because the Westerns always we can speculate that they live the luxurious life or they live the best life that they could comparing to the Eastern world or at least East Europe. So everyone's hungry for that.
Yeah. Um, I mean, our next topic is quite related to this, so I think we could just jump into it because it's kind of continuing on to the discussion. I'm just going to change the topic now if you want to just introduce it.
Right. So next we're going to talk about the Russian Civil War, which is quite close after selling Alaska, and I think this
No,
is also.
it's not close because
Oh, it's
Alaska was
not.
67, so the Russian Civil
Right,
War
right,
was
right.
17.
Right, my bad. I was thinking of something else.
Yeah.
I think it's really important, especially the Civil War is kind of played a very important factor between the performance that the Russians had during World War II, as well as kind of placing the real footsteps or the basis of communism, or the communism that followed to be in the USSR.
So I'll just introduce the topic real quick. The Russian Civil War started in 1917 when the Bolsheviks took over the Saint Petersburg and Moscow what they're called Soviets. Yeah. So these Soviets were kind of like the secondary power that a city had. It was kind of a council created to oversee and rule the region, but it was ultimately ruled over or overseen by the parliament, which ruled the country after Tsar Nicholas was deposed. This allowed the communists to gain a lot of power, and by 1917, in the brief period from when Tsar Nicholas was deposed and Russia was turned into a democracy to the Civil War, the Soviets quickly gained power through mostly Lenin, who went around and told the people that if the Soviets came to power, they would receive land, bread, and peace, which at the time the peasants of the country were starving, so obviously bread was a good thing. The peasants were still kind of under. They weren't slaves because the slavery of the peasantry was abolished before, but even though it was legally abolished, they were still kind of the most of the peasants in the countryside were still kind of locked to the land that they were working because
forced labor.
Yeah, because they had no way to get out of this. Because when you have no resources, when you're in this position, you can't really just pick up all of your stuff and move because you have no resources to do this. So
And I just wanted to add that it's kind of that Eastern European ideology, which many of the Westerns might not know, is that the people in East Europe, this ideology has been influenced mainly by communism, is that I live this life. I don't have much, but I'm okay with what I have, because that's the way communism thought people. You should be happy with what you have, but knowing that you're gonna have this for the rest of your life. But we will give you all the necessary things. We will give you a shovel. We will give you whatever you need to work in your agriculture and so on and so forth. So it's this mentality, and then it's also the religious influence, I would say, put into this, because communist people at the time, they were really religious, especially the Orthodox, and also just simply thanking God for what they have,
yeah.
and not asking for more.
Oscar, hold on with your answer. You say the world would have been a worse place, but we better dead than red. Well, okay. You Google what that slogan means, because that is actually going against what you were saying. What you said 2 lines
You're
above.
contradicting yourself.
Yeah, you're contradicting yourself. So obviously, what was I saying? So land, bread, and peace, and the third piece was something that the whole country wanted, because the Russia had been a war against the Central Powers for a very long time, and they didn't have the capacity, the economical capacity, and the manpower to really fight Germany, who, even though it wasn't World War II Germany, it was still a very powerful country. So all of these factors combined led to the Soviets gaining power, and leading to the revolution in that we know as the October Revolution. It wasn't actually in October in our calendar because it's named. It was the revolution started in October in the Gregorian calendar, which is 15 days difference, something along those lines. I don't remember exactly,
Yeah.
but it's slightly different than the calendar that the West uses. So after this revolution, the Soviets took power of two key locations. They took over St. Petersburg and Moscow, which was the industrial heartland of the USSR at the time, and the land in between them to obviously connect it. And during the Civil War, they fought against all of the people who supported the Tsar, all of the nationalists, and all of the factions that went against the communists. So you had legions that were sent in by the Americans and the British that were trying to fight against them. You had old generals, part of the Imperial Army, who were supporting the Tsar and wanted the Tsar to be put back on the throne. You had people who wanted a democratic Russia, who were also fighting on the side of the whites. You had foreign legions, like I said, famously the Czech Legion took over the Trans-Siberian Railway at a point during the Civil War, and it was overall a really messy ordeal because even though the whites being the counter Soviets, outnumbered them and outgunned them, due to each general and each legion and each person that was part of the white movement having a different idea of what they wanted Russia to be like, they couldn't ever get together enough to fight against the Soviets, which all had one unified goal of turning Russia at communist. So as such, Russia, with the help of Trotsky, who was a quite smart military tactician, managed to push back the whites and take over the country. By 1921, all of the Russian territory, which Russia held after they peaced out during the what was the peace treaty called? I'm gonna have to Google it because I don't remember.
Too many things to remember.
Yeah, it was the Brest-Litovsk Treaty. So after the treaty of Brest-Litovsk, you know what I mean. So after the treaty that took Russia out of World War One, all of the land that remained was taken over back by the Reds by 1921. As such, they took over the land through a bunch of purges, which we talked about during our secret police episode that is available on our YouTube if you'd like to learn more. They purged all of the nationalists that fought against them. So the question is now, what if the communists didn't end up winning the Civil War? Because it took a lot of luck from the communists to it took a lot of luck and skill for the Soviets to win. We have a comment on Twitch. Do you think if King George V accepted the Russian Tsar political asylum, will it change the face of history? Yeah, this is actually a very good way to start this topic because one of the main reasons why the Civil War ended so abruptly and badly was because the Tsar died. He was killed by the I don't remember exactly what by what Soviets. It was I think it was the Ural Soviet leader who was holding the Russian royal family in a dacha, basically it was a prison, but it was a quite nice house in the Ural region. And one day he decided that he needed to kill them because the white forces were incoming. And although it's debated if the leadership of the Soviet Union, well, the Soviets at the time, which would have been Lenin and Trotsky, ordered this execution, it's not very relevant to us because if we think about what this would have done, I think that with the Tsar alive in Britain, he would have been able to pull together more of the white forces because a lot of the white forces, a lot of the white forces were split. A lot of the imperial generals were split in what they wanted to see the country become after the war. So with the with the Russian Tsar remaining alive, it would have meant that these all Tsarist generals with control from the Tsar in Britain might have been able to pool all their resources together and push back the relatively weak communists, if this was done at the beginning of the Civil War, before the communists could organize all of their factories and get all the people on their side and fight. Andrei, if you want to add a bit more on this, I've got a bit more on the peasantry after.
We have, first of all, we have another comment from Chippy saying the communists killed the Tsar and Lenin took over the country. I want to add one thing, saying that I know some people are going to shout at me for this. I always like to emphasize that there's a big difference between communism and socialism, and Lenin was more of a socialist rather than a communist. And I know, again, that socialism is pretty much the basis of communism. It's the footsteps of what it became. But there is a big difference between the communist Soviet Union before Stalin and after, because the Soviet Union and under the communist regime of Stalin was quite different because it was harsh. Like we talked in our previous episode where we were talking about secret police mainly in the Soviet Union. We described pretty much the ways that he would get anything that he wanted, and he would eliminate anyone that he might have seen as a threat. Whereas Lenin was more of the type of leader that would actually try to convince people by doing things, and not necessarily fearing that he can be taken by someone else down. He would do this thing where he would it's funny because I read this story. He would do this thing where when he tried to go and take soldiers or people under his ring, recruit more people for the cause that he was fighting for, he would give his watch to one of the soldiers, representing that, I'm ready to share everything with you. What is yours is mine, and vice versa. But he had like 1,000 of those watches, and he was doing the same thing everywhere he was going in every region.
I mean, Lenin had a big impact, and this could be something that we look into after we look at if the communists didn't win the Civil War. But Lenin was a key part of the Communist Party, and if his condition didn't worsen after the attempted assassination that happened in 1922, the Soviet Union would have taken a much different direction, because he was more of a person who would like to compromise. Often when the people of his that were part of the party would argue, he would because he was seen as such a integral part of the party, he would tell them, if you guys don't stop fighting and we don't reach a compromise, I will resign and leave the party. And this would more often than not just end the discussion there, and people would instantly compromise and reach a conclusion that would benefit the country. Because there was a lot of factionalism after his death, this meant that this excuse could not be used, because there was no one like him in the party that reached the same level of prestige that he did. Not even Trotsky, who was basically Lenin's right-hand man throughout the whole of the Civil War, had that much respect, which was mostly because personal traits, but that's a topic for another day.
Should I take the comments? Because I think that's where we went.
Yeah, sure.
So we have a few more comments from Chippy saying, Lenin done good for the country, but the next after him was Stalin, and this is the problem. On this, I would say that, yes, of course, I agree with you that Lenin was a much better leader, because he cared more about the people of the country and the country itself, rather than going against an enemy and just doing whatever and showing power. But I think about this, right? Because I don't think if, let's say, Lenin was to be in power during World War II, he wouldn't have won the war. He couldn't have taken the Soviet Union through the war. Just to show a comparison between the leaders, because I'm saying that Stalin was bad, but that kind of bad or harshness that he had was required, at least for that period, to win the Second World War.
Yeah. I mean, I don't know. I think that although we think of Lenin as being a bit more moderate, he could be as as
As harsh as
dangerous
Stalin.
and as dangerous and harsh as Stalin.
I'm not
Because-
saying no. I'm not saying no, but
Yeah.
not necessarily harsh. Because this is what I'm trying to remark. Harsh on the people.
Because we see things like he did well, after the Civil War. We see that he compromised with the people. He didn't just jump into communism and socialism. He like kind of gave the people a transitional period through the new economic plan, which allowed people to still kind of run a semi-capitalist system with like small enterprises being allowed to run, but bigger enterprises being state-owned. But at the end of the day, Lenin did hold party purges like Stalin did. He did go and kill people that he saw as threats. He wasn't as nice as many of us think, and this would only evolve as his reign went, because even if there was no assassination attempt, his mental state would have deteriorated, and in the end, it would have still been a competition between the next upcoming Hitler and next upcoming leader, sorry, being either Stalin or
You have a problem with Hitler. You always throw him somewhere.
yeah, no, it's obviously it's been part of the discussion quite a lot. Chippy says there is no
I think he wants to say comparison.
comparison between Lenin and Stalin. Yeah, no, that's not what I'm trying to argue. Obviously, Stalin was a much worse man, but again, Lenin would have been a. It's a very good debate, but I think if Lenin went on to live longer, I think that Stalin would have not ended up rising to power after him, because Lenin wouldn't have lived up to World War II. It would have been very improbable, and his prodigy was Trotsky initially, because Trotsky was his right hand man. He was with the party for a much longer time than Stalin. He obviously led the Red Army during the Civil War, as we're discussing now, and he was a much more impactful member of the party. The only reason why he didn't end up the next leader in our like timeline is because he had a very abrasive personality, which meant that people didn't really find him as appealing as Stalin, who was much more like social. Could you say like more charismatic?
Yeah.
Chippy says Ken looks a bit like Hitler. Put a small moustache and you'll see.
We'll have to remove something else as well first.
Yeah, I already have the hairstyle.
What I wanted to say is that if you were to take Lenin and Stalin, I know this isn't the best mix, I think you would get Trotsky. Trotsky had kind of the best things of both, being charismatic, when needed, and then trying to be harsh. I know it's not really, but
I mean, Trotsky's not often talked about because he's more of a background character. But from what I've researched, Trotsky was much more brutal than both Lenin and Stalin, because we don't really see that side of him, because during his exile he often wrote theory about communism and was much more of an academic, which we don't really think of academics as like killers. But in reality, during his brief few years in the leadership of the Soviet Union, as part of the leadership of the Soviet Union, he put forward some ideas which Lenin found quite despicable, and it's theorized that if he ended up being the next leader of the Soviet Union, it would have been similar, if not worse, to what Stalin did with the purges during the 30s and so on. It's obviously we will never know what Trotsky would have done, because maybe he could have switched it up, maybe he learned from his mistakes, but it would have been a quite hard sell to the leaders of the party, because at heart Trotsky was an idealist. He liked to think of like the ideal scenario of things and put it into practice. And Stalin was more like someone who just wanted to get something done. And the people of the party didn't really like that theoretical side, even though Lenin was kind of a mix between these two.
It didn't really go well with the region, with East Europe. Wasn't the style. Even when the Russian Empire was, they were working the same way. They didn't really I'm not gonna say they weren't that diplomatic, but they were more action forced. Just take decisions there and then. Not really having such a big discussion with who else may think or how this would influence that. If they wanted to attack a country, they would. They wouldn't think of, oh, but this might happen or that other country might come against us.
There was a big gap between the rest of the members of the Communist Party at the time and Lenin, and I mean Trotsky, because Trotsky was much more educated than everyone else. He went through the primary, secondary, and went education, and ended up going to university to study the theory of everything that he
At
led.
that time, the percentage of people actually going to university was very low.
Yeah.
Especially in the Soviet Union.
Even literacy rates were absolutely appalling, which was something that obviously the communists countered to try to feed the people as much propaganda as possible. But even with like this slightly higher level of competency in education, Lenin or Trotsky, again, if I confuse them, was much more academic than anyone else in the party, and this created a lot of conflict between them, because obviously Lenin didn't, Trotsky didn't, and he knew that he was smarter than everyone there and never wanted to concede any fight.
Hitler.
No, yeah, it's I don't know why I'm confusing them though. That's the third time I think, but yeah, it's I think we've deviated a little bit. I think we should
Yeah, we have focused more on the Civil
yeah.
War. And what would have happened if?
What
what would have happened if the Whites would have won?
Yeah. So I think for the Whites to win, there needs to be a few things happen. Obviously, as GP mentioned, the Tsar would have needed to be kept alive to bring the Whites together as a kind of a figurehead for something that everyone to fight for. The Whites would also have to be much nicer to the peasants of the countryside, because that was a really big mistake that a lot of the generals made. They would go into a village, raze it to the ground, and the people who lived in that village saw what the Whites did, and they were like, well, these guys aren't treating us very nicely. We should go to these guys who are probably going to treat us a bit better than kill and burn half of our family. So a lot of people were radicalized by this and went over to the other side. So if the Whites ended up allying the people of the countryside and being like, we know that you've lived until now with a lack of food, a lack of like basic rights. If we win, then you will have access to these rights, because we're looking to try to make a new Russia, not the old Tsarist Russia, like a Russia for the people. If they fed a bit of propaganda to the people of the countryside rather than raiding and burning their villages, it would have gotten a lot more people on their side, meaning that the communists would have lacked a lot more support than they had, and would have probably been the edge that they needed to win the Civil War. Chippy said, why did King George did accept his cousin and his best friend? I don't know, because it's King George did end up sending support forces to Russia to fight against the communists during the Civil War. So I don't know why he didn't accept Tsar Nicholas as his to England to come into exile, because they were obviously part of the same side of the war, so there would be no conflict in that regard. But I think it was more of a logistical problem, because as the Civil War started, the family was quite deep in the Urals, and the only realistic way of getting them out would have been traveling all the way to Finland, who was neutral, and then using Norway, which wasn't willing to accept the royal family, because they thought that this would count as a act of war against the Soviets, and then come to Britain. So I know they were very good friends and cousins. They were a lot of the it is said that World War I was fought between cousins, because the King of Germany, the Tsar of Russia, the King of England were all cousins. They were all related to Queen Victoria, I think.
Yeah, I think it was. Yeah.
Or it's either Queen Victoria or Queen Elizabeth. I don't remember, but it was they were all related to this one monarch, and they all lived together as children, or lived in proximity as children, so they were all quite close. So fighting a war, this created a lot of friction, especially in Russia, because a lot of Russians saw the Tsar as somebody who was being lenient in the war, and that was partly why he was deposed. They saw him being lenient because he was fighting against his cousin, and they were like, family can't really fight family efficiently. So that was one of the reasons why he was deposed in the end. But in terms of why they weren't given asylum, I think it was more of a logistical thing rather than something that King Charles didn't want, because obviously the family connection is there, the friendship connection is there. It was just that it would have been very hard, near impossible, to evacuate them, because as soon as the civil war started, the royal family switched hands from the democratic government to the Soviet government, and they kept the family on tight lock. It was actually above in one of the windows of the houses that the royal family was being held in. They had a machine gun that was being used in the trenches. They took it from the trenches to the house in case anyone tried to attack the house to take the king. They had a way to defend the king.
Themselves.
Yeah. Chibi says the same happened to King Michael of Romania. Andrei, you probably know a bit more about this. And Queen Elizabeth. So I'm not sure.
What are you referring to exactly by that? I think he's referring to when, at the end, after they won the war, when the Soviets came and forced him to either exile the country or he would have been executed. Allowing them to run a communist regime.
So the Queen didn't accept Michael.
Yeah. I didn't know exactly what you're referring to.
Okay, I see. Yeah. What was I saying? I think that obviously, as we mentioned, the Tsar would have had to be alive, and I think this would have been enough for the whites to band together and push back the Soviets, and it would have probably led to the Tsar coming back in power, or he would have come back as a figurehead, because it would have the country would have needed something to hold itself together. It's why figureheads really exist. It's something that during World War I and World War II really helped the UK, because a lot of propaganda was do it for the king, do it for the queen, something along those lines. It really helped keep the nation together. So in a post-revolution Russia that would have led with the whites winning, I think it would have turned into something along the lines of a constitutional monarchy, like we see in the United Kingdom, with the king holding more of a ceremonial role, and the rest of the government going a more democratic route. Now, the outcome of the democracy would really be in the hands of what would happen post World War One, because as we know, Germany was a democracy after World War One. And they were, through the hardships that the German people went through, they were radicalized into accepting this evil ideology. And I think that Russia, due to the state that the country was in, even before World War One, would have fallen into the same trap, and maybe ended up going fascist as Germany did.
But then we have to go back, and I know you might not want to because it's going to go really long, back to World War II and see what would have happened. Because, I mean, if you have no communists and you have a democratic country, I think the scenario that you gave before, when we were talking about Alaska, would have been more plausible in that case.
Yeah.
Not having a communist Soviet Union, but rather a democratic one.
Yeah.
They would have accepted, the alliance. And at the same time, maybe Hitler would have seen, the Soviet Union different.
Yeah, it would have definitely made World War II completely different, because obviously we don't know, maybe.
But then again, would have the Russians attacked Poland?
I think I'm not sure, because the thing is that really
Because
think.
I don't think they would have had the reasoning. As communists, they wanted, you know, they went there for a certain reason, but as Democrats, I don't think.
Oscar says he tuned in at the right moment. We're talking about Poland being annihilated. And I think that the post World War One Russia would have been radicalized somehow because the conditions that the country was seeing weren't really the best. So I think that due to all of the generals that took part in the Civil War having a lot of power after the Civil War would have been over, I think that the country would have gone a much more nationalistic route, which would lean more into the Nazi mindset than we saw in Germany. So I think we would have seen the countries band together much quicker, although Hitler did still hate the Slavs. So there's obviously a point of contention between the two countries. But I think that as happened with the Molotov-Ribbentrop Pact, it would have been something that they could put apart for the benefit of both nations. Then obviously the Germans would invade, maybe with the help of the Soviets, the help of the Russians, maybe not, depending on how close they would ally. But I think with both countries having a quite similar goal of just increasing their power as all nationalistic nations do, I think that both nations would align much closer and probably end up being allies by the end of the war, as Japan and Italy ended up being.
And Romania.
And Bulgaria. And Hungary. And
because you see, when you think about it, this is just an extra there. A lot of people, when they talk about saying, "Oh, but Hitler, Germany only had Italy as his ally," but no, people don't know that actually it was quite a big part. I mean, especially Hungary was still, obviously, it didn't have the power that they had back in the day, but still, they had the manpower, which was really required, and without it, they probably would have could have completed Operation Barbarossa. Also with the help of the Romanian soldiers, military.
Well, we had Chippy here. He says, during the Cold War, Nikita Khrushchev said to Mao Zedong that Berlin is the testicles of the West. Every time I want to make the West scream, I squeeze on Berlin. Yeah, I mean, we saw this kind of personalized in the Berlin airlift, where Stalin just closed off Berlin, and he was like, unless you give Berlin to me, I'm just going to starve the people of Berlin. And the US the whole of the Allies just para dropped coal, food, and resources in. So Berlin is probably 2 seconds. This confirms that statement that the obviously the US Berlin was the God, my thought process has just gone all over the place. What was I saying? Well, you continue on the topic, Andrei. I've lost my train of thought.
You're gonna be lost, eh?
Yeah.
So where were we left?
So I think that that was probably the end of the topic, to be honest.
We're going again. Cold War, World War II, Cold War. World
yeah,
War II. But I mean, those are the main. The thing is that those are the main events that have taken place. You know, after everything happened. Either if we're talking about the whites winning the Russian Civil War, or Russia once again not selling Alaska. I think that World War II, and maybe not so sure about the Cold War, but World War II would have mostly still happened. Even though, because I don't think that Russia being democratic or communist would have influenced Germany to not start.
No, but I'm saying that Russia would have turned fascist.
Would you think so?
Yeah, because like I said, it would turn nationalistic at least, because the people who would have held the power after the Civil War would have been the generals, who were very nationalistic. I
guess, yeah, you're right, because it depends very much on the leader that you have, because starting a fascist ruling, a fascist regime, does require, just like you said, an iconic persona, someone that the people can go off, and someone that can easily influence propaganda into the people.
Of course, they would need a figurehead, but I think even if the nation would have remained democratic, they would have been heavily right-winged because of the people who had influence over the country at the time.
Any other thoughts or questions on this topic from the comment section?
I don't see anything else. I think that's more than enough talking about alternate history. We've been here for an hour and 20 minutes. That's probably, I think, the longest that we've done a podcast for. The first one might have been a bit longer, actually. I don't remember.
Yeah, I think, but then we had a lot of technical difficulties at the start.
Yeah.
So it took us quite a while, and then your computer crashed in the middle of it.
But yeah, I think we can move on to the outro. I think that was more than enough for today.
Let's just wait and see if...
if anyone else wants to have some last comments. If not, we'll move on to the outro because...
Or any other questions.
Yeah.
Also, about Alaska being sold by the Russians to the Americans, Calin has wrote an article, I think even a year ago. And I will put that on a link to the article on Facebook right after we finish the podcast for more information if you're interested. And for the Civil War, if you want to find more information, I mean, has anyone written anything about the Civil War?
I've written parts about it. It's not.
I guess in that case, I would say a documentary might be a better.
I've written about the Romanovs, so that kind of touches on the Civil War a little bit. It touches on what happened to them and how they ended up in the position that they were in. Can we discuss the Pepsi being a military power? That is a good topic for the next podcast, actually, because we don't really have any topics. I'll move on to the outro because we don't really have anyone else adding on to what we're talking about. So what I was going to say is... so what I was going to say is that we do indeed need topics for the next podcast. So that is probably a very good one to talk about. I know, Oscar, you've written an article about that, so we could probably use that as reference. But we would like to get some more topics about the that we could talk about. So if you have anything...
please do email us at historyofyesterday@gmail.com, and also do tell more people about the stream and the podcast. Because what we want to do here is not just us talking and storytelling all the time. We want to have a lot more interaction with the audience, so we can have more interesting discussions. Like I said, I hope that you did enjoy this podcast on alternate history. We're gonna do many more like this because it's really interesting to talk about possibilities of how history could have, how a small change could have changed pretty much the whole world. So yeah. Again, I think World War II and the Cold War, that they're expecting a lot more attention and a lot more detail.
Yeah. We have Chippy saying, what about the German POWs that were taken to look for landmines in Holland? Okay. I'll have a look into that. I haven't actually heard about that.
Oh, I've heard about it. That's interesting, actually.
Well, then you can talk about that, and I can talk about Pepsi because I think I know a bit more about Pepsi. But yeah, so Oscar, you actually enjoyed. Thank you. This was much more like easy for us because both of us have a lot of knowledge about the 20th century, so it's a much easier way to talk about it. We'll definitely do something in the future on a quite similar nature. So
we might have a guest on our next podcast.
Yeah,
not sure about that. We're still waiting a response from the guest.
Yeah, depending on the topic, we will announce you as usual on Facebook. So with that said, I'm going to roll the outro scene as usual. Thank you for joining us. As usual, stay safe. We
have a lovely evening.
Yeah, of course, and we'll see you next time. Have a good night.